For centuries, the Shroud of Turin, housed in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy since the 16th century, has fascinated and baffled scientists and historians alike. The shroud, a 14-foot-long linen cloth that bears a faint yellowed image of a crucified man, has long been believed by many to be the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth. After centuries of continuous efforts by scientists to search for evidence and unravel the mysteries surrounding the shroud, numerous reports have been published. As someone with a deep interest in this precious linen cloth, Mel Gibson stunned everyone when he shared his perspective on the shroud. It turns out that what we have believed all along might very well be a mistake. The Shroud of Turin dates back to the time of Jesus. A study published in the Heritage Journal by Italian researchers suggests that the Shroud of Turin could date back 2,000 years, aligning with the time of Jesus. The research team, led by Liberato De Caro from the Institute of Crystallography in Italy, employed a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering to analyze the structural degradation of ancient linen fibers to determine their age. Applying this method to a small sample from the shroud housed in Turin's Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, the researchers obtained results fully compatible with a linen sample historically dated to 55 to 74 CE. The authors argue that the earlier radiocarbon tests conducted in 1988 may have been compromised by contamination. The researchers acknowledge the need for further, more extensive analysis using their X-ray technique to confirm their findings and potentially settle the long-standing debate about the shroud. The study emphasizes that these results depend on the shroud being kept under specific environmental conditions of temperature and humidity for centuries, including periods with unknown storage conditions. The mystery surrounding the shroud led Mel Gibson delved into the secrets of the shroud, the resurrection, and the nature of faith. While some view the recent study as evidence supporting the shroud's authenticity, others remain unconvinced. Many scientists argue that inconsistencies in carbon dating, possible contamination, and lack of definitive proof leave room for doubt. Experts have long debated the authenticity of the shroud, and while the recent findings undermine the idea of it being a medieval invention, they do not provide definitive proof of its authenticity. The Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth measuring 4.3 meters by 1.1 meters, imprinted by the body of a man who appears to have suffered the wounds of crucifixion. Many people believe it to be the burial cloth of Jesus, captivating believers and skeptics for centuries. The cloth bears two images, both the front and back, of a gaunt man who is around 5 feet 7 inches tall. The placement of stains on the shroud is consistent with severe injuries, including puncture wounds to the scalp, whip marks, and deep nail wounds through the wrists and feet. When researchers tested the blood on the shroud, they found it was human blood from a male, consistent with the telltale signs of scourging and crucifixion recorded in the Gospels. Australian journalist William West argued that the image on the shroud could not have been created by any known human technique, and that the event that imprinted the image exceeds the technological capabilities of any known period before the modern era. We see the exact same image of the face of Jesus in coins that corresponds with the face of Jesus on the shroud, said Dr. Jeremiah J. Johnston, a New Testament scholar, pastor. A mystery that continues to fascinate. After centuries of scientific testing and debate, the Shroud of Turin remains one of the most intriguing religious artifacts in the world for both skeptics and believers, researchers and theologians. Renowned author, journalist, and researcher William West, an expert on the shroud's authenticity, addressed a packed audience at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in the Bondi district of Sydney. During his talk, he presented 10 pieces of compelling evidence out of 99 he found that support the shroud's historical and scientific significance. West reminisced on his journey with the shroud, which started in Summerhill, Australia, in the 1980s, when he was advised to watch the documentary The Silent Witness. a film that greatly expanded interest in the Shroud worldwide. Then came the carbon dating results of the late 1980s, claiming it only dated between 1260 and 1790. Believing the revelations, when West saw a poster of the Shroud in a Catholic bookstore, he thought to himself, "Those people are still promoting this route. Don't they realize that it's a fake?" He decided, as a scholar, to explain to people why it really is a fake, and started doing research. Delving deeper into the literature, West discovered evidence that led him to reconsider his position. In 2024, he published a book, The Shroud Rises, as the carbon date is buried, in which he suggests the 1988 carbon date for the Shroud has finally been shown to be seriously flawed. Newer dating tests have indicated the Shroud is 2,000 years old. It's covered in blood. That's one of the first things you notice about the Shroud, he explained. He described how not only are the obvious wounds, such as the large blood flow from the side, evident, but every scourge mark on both the front and back of the cloth is accompanied by bloodstains. The research has shown very clearly that those blood flows and clots are 100% accurate and intact. Once the blood soaks in and dries, everyone knows it sticks hard. And when you force it off, the blood clots break. But on the Shroud, all of those blood clots covering the whole body are all intact. Forensic pathologists from all over the world have studied it, some of the leading experts in the field, and they've been absolutely amazed at how precise the details are. Artists, by contrast, usually depict mere dribbles of blood. The Shroud actually shows clots of blood. Every deposit is an intact clot. West further emphasized his point by referencing Pierre Barbet, a French surgeon who spent much of World War I treating battlefield casualties before becoming a leading professor and head surgeon at a major Paris hospital. Barbet was basically obsessed with blood, and through that, he became obsessed with the Shroud, West explained. He said that he just couldn't fault it at all, and for him, that one aspect of the Shroud was enough to convince him that it was definitely our Lord. Other evidence West spoke about related to clear signs of dirt from Jerusalem. They found that dirt had a chemical fingerprint, a special limestone soil not really found anywhere else in the world, around the knees and nose, he said. Lastly, West spoke on a close-up of the linen fabric itself. Now, the image itself, science has discovered that because it's not made from any artistic materials, like paint, and ink or dye, the only way scientists can reproduce this even today is by using a huge burst of ultraviolet light from excellent lasers, West explained. However, they could never ever produce the whole image because it would take more electrical power than we have even today, he said. The two historical gaps. Jean-Christian Petitfils, who has studied the Holy Shroud for more than 40 years, discusses the findings detailed in his new book that is labeled as a definitive investigation of the precious linen cloth. The Shroud of Turin, which is believed to have wrapped Jesus' body after his crucifixion, is a seemingly inexhaustible source of discoveries and disputes between historians and scientists, and between men of faith themselves, some seeing it as a simple icon symbolizing the death and resurrection of Christ, while others remain convinced of its authenticity because of the numerous studies supporting this idea. French historian Jean-Christian Petitfils is one of the latter. About the Shroud of Turin, it was thought that there were two historical gaps. In reality, there is only one. It is true that, because of this, the historical method does not allow to consider that the Shroud is authentic. Only science allows it. There is a gap between April 5th, 33, which corresponds to Easter Day, when Simon Peter and John the Evangelist discovered the Shroud on the stone bench in the Holy Sepulchre, as if the body had disappeared from inside, and the year 387 to 388, the date of the probable arrival of the Shroud in the Mesopotamian city of Edessa. We do not know indeed what happened in between. It was also thought that there was a historical gap at the time of the sack of Constantinople in 1204. But we now know that the shroud escaped the sack, was transferred to France, and kept in the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. Then it was transferred to the House of Savoy, and finally to the Holy See in 1983. About the prudence that the Church has shown in recent years, Jean agreed it is true that Sixtus IV and Julius II were convinced of the authenticity of the shroud. Julius II had a mass written in its honor. John Paul II himself, after the carbon-14 experiment, reaffirmed that it was not an icon, but an authentic relic. However, his successors are more cautious, because the Holy Shroud has become a scientific object. It is therefore difficult for the Church to give an opinion, and it is not her role to do so. Its role is to announce the death and resurrection of Jesus, nothing more. He understands this position very well and thinks that the Church will never go back on it. Among the false shrouds, we are familiar with the one from Compiègne, which disappeared in the 19th century, and indeed, the Shroud of Cadouin, preserved in an abbey in the Périgord region in France, which gave rise in the Middle Ages to many pilgrimages, with indulgences granted by the papacy and subsidies by the French monarchy. However, it was discovered in 1934 that this shroud was in reality a Fatimid standard imported from the East, with inscriptions in Kufic script to the glory of Emir al-Mustali. Among the real relics, there is first of all the Shroud of Oviedo, which is not a shroud but a cloth that was placed on the face of Jesus at the time of the descent from the cross, and which contains blood flows. There is no face printed on it, but the bloodstains match perfectly with the bloodstains of the man in the Holy Shroud. We also know that the blood type is the same. It is the blood group AB. The same is true for the tunic of Argenteuil, which Jesus seems to have worn on the way to the cross. There, too, some bloodstains overlap with those on the Holy Shroud. The three relics have had very different journeys and have traveled to very different places and times, but the same Near Eastern pollens have been found on all three. Their authenticity is thus attested. A 1935 letter by writer Paul Claudel about the Holy Shroud, which describes it as a second resurrection, which means a lot to Christians. There seems to have been a will of providence to preserve this cloth as a testimony to the world. What is really amazing is the way it has escaped destruction several times and two fires, the last one in 1997, when the Cathedral of Turin burned down. Mario Trematore, the firefighter on site, was moved by a particular grace and an inner voice that told him, "Strike here, on this side, not here." He was driven by a feeling that was perhaps divine. He took a sledgehammer, broke the glass protection to save the relic, and admitted himself that if it had been a work of a great Italian Renaissance painter, he would not have taken so many risks. The Shroud of Turin made most of us understand that the resurrection was not simply a symbol, as many unfortunately think, but a historical reality. Christ is risen, body and soul. Knights secretly protected Shroud of Turin. A Vatican researcher has found evidence that the Knights Templar, the medieval crusading order, held secret custody of the Shroud of Turin during the 13th and 14th centuries. The shroud, which bears the image of a man and is believed by many to have been the burial cloth of Jesus, was probably used in a secret Templar ritual to underline Christ's humanity in the face of popular heresies of the time, the expert said. A person who works in the Vatican secret archives said documents that came to light during research on the 14th century trial of the Templars contained a description of a Templar initiation ceremony. The document recounts how a Templar leader, after guiding a young initiate into a hidden room, showed him a long linen cloth that bore the impressed figure of a man, and ordered him to worship it, kissing the feet 3 times. The idea that the Knights Templar were secret custodians of the shroud was put forward by British historian Ian Wilson in 1978. Frail said the account of the initiation ceremony, along with a number of other pieces of evidence, supports that theory. The shroud's history has long been the subject of debate. It was believed by some to have been in Constantinople, now Istanbul, Turkey, when the city was sacked during the Crusades in 1204. It turned up for public display in France in 1357, and today is kept in the Cathedral of Turin, Italy. The cloth's image, according to some experts, corresponds with that of a man who was scourged and crucified. A scientist said the Knights Templar may have kept the shroud secret because of papal orders of excommunication for anyone involved in looting relics from Constantinople or trafficking in them afterward. This person said the shroud's image was particularly important for the Knights Templar as an antidote to the heresies that had arisen, especially those that affirmed that Christ was a purely spiritual being and never really had a human body or shed human blood. The carbon dating is fake. For most of the 20th century, there was a growing conviction around the world that the Shroud of Turin was the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, carrying a mysterious photographic image of Jesus' body between death and resurrection. Then came the carbon dating of 1988, allegedly proving the shroud was a medieval forgery. Overnight, the shroud went from Christendom's most prized artifact to being considered a mere icon, albeit a powerfully moving one. According to Mel Gibson, now after almost 4 decades of further research, the shroud has undergone a form of resurrection. The latest findings indicate it was the carbon dating that was fake, not the shroud. He gonna explains why the carbon dating is now considered by many shroud researchers as fatally flawed. The game changer that has reduced the carbon dating to a footnote in the shroud's history has been the long overdue release of the original raw data from the carbon dating that was locked away for 28 years, despite repeated requests for the British Museum and the 3 carbon dating labs to release it. The hidden truth about the carbon dating was first brought to light by a series of articles in peer-reviewed academic journals. But the full meaning of these academic assessments has now been made accessible to a wider audience by a series of articles and books explaining the flaws of the carbon dating in terms most people can grasp. One shroud researcher who has done much to explain the failings of the carbon dating is nuclear engineer Robert Rucker. Rucker has written many articles explaining where the carbon dating went wrong. His most comprehensive report is a series of 3 articles titled "The Carbon Dating Problem for the Shroud of Turin." At the other end of the spectrum is the 800-page tome, The 1988 C-14 Dating of the Shroud of Turin, a stunning exposé by shroud researcher Joseph G. Marino. The astonishing detail offered by this book may not be for everyone, but the book has been widely acclaimed as indispensable for serious shroud researchers. In the middle of the 2 extremes is Michael Kowalski's recent book, The Shroud of Christ, Evidence of a 2,000-Year Antiquity. Kowalski, the current editor of the British Shroud of Turin newsletter, is a physics graduate who also studied statistical analysis. He is also a member of the International Shroud Science Group, SSG, a body of senior scientists composed, at last count, of 147 scientists, including skeptics, from all over the world. Members of the SSG examine shroud research and take part in vigorous debates on subjects that have now included the latest revelations about the raw carbon dating data. The main conclusion from all of this research is that the carbon daters got it wrong, and that there is really no reliable evidence at all that the shroud is a medieval forgery. In fact, close examination of the carbon dating data indicates the carbon-14 measurements in 1988 reveals that the carbon date was not reliable at all, and that the carbon daters should have admitted defeat. In other words, they should have told the world their efforts to come up with a reliable date for the shroud had failed. In addition to the basic evidence indicating the carbon dating was fatally flawed, there are other new evidences that supports the authenticity of the shroud. First, there are the latest dating tests on the shroud. One test that received extensive media coverage around the world in the second half of 2024 is based on a new technique for dating linen cloth using an X-ray dating method that has found the shroud is 2,000 years old. Known as wide-angle X-ray scattering, WAX-S, the method was developed by a researcher from Italy's Institute of Crystallography, Dr. Liberato De Caro, a member of Italy's National Research Council. Nevertheless, the truth is now well and truly out. Several other new dating techniques have been applied to the shroud by prominent shroud researcher Professor Giulio Fanti, an expert in mechanical engineering from the University of Padua. Professor Fanti has developed 3 separate dating tests based on chemical and mechanical dating that determined an average age for the shroud of 33 BC plus or minus 250 years, clearly indicating the cloth's origin is far from the Middle Ages and more likely to be from the 1st century. Interestingly, in his book, Michael Kowalski has revealed that these dating tests have had a positive response from members of the Shroud Science Group. They have pointed out that the results are important given that they draw on 3 very different dating methods that have led to the same conclusions. In addition to all these new dating tests, there has been a great deal of other research since 1988 that is seen as confirming the shroud's authenticity. Among the most important findings from this research has been the discovery that the image on the shroud is likely to have been formed by bursts of light in the form of ultraviolet radiation. The main question about the image on the cloth has always been how the photographic quality of image on the cloth could have been created. It certainly could not have been done by any artistic technique because there are no traces of artists' materials, like paint, pigment, ink, or dye, on the cloth. In fact, the image on the shroud is so superficial, confined to the topmost layer of microscopic fibers on the cloth, that it could not have involved any fluid or gas, both of which would have penetrated far more deeply into the linen cloth. The key research here was carried out by Senior Researcher and Chief of Research at Italy's National Council for New Technology, Energy, and the Environment, ENEA, Dr. Paolo Di Lazzaro. Working with a team of researchers using fine-tuned excimer laser equipment, he was able to achieve coloration of linen cloth matching the quality and coloration of the image on the shroud. All these developments, the duplication of the qualities of the image on the linen cloth, the new dating techniques that dated the shroud to the 1st century, and the discovery of the flaws in the carbon dating of the shroud in 1988, now support the conclusion that the shroud is indeed genuine, the actual burial cloth of Jesus. In the process, they also support the conclusion that Jesus not only lived, but he died by crucifixion and rose from the dead in a process involving a massive burst of radiant energy that formed the mysterious image on the 2,000-year-old burial cloth. The Man of the Holy Shroud. For decades, as worshippers gather around the world to commemorate Christ's passion, death, and resurrection, scientists have been studying the results of tests made on an object alleged to be directly connected with that passion. The object of intense religious devotion, as well as scientific curiosity, is a simple strip of linen known as the Shroud of Turin. It has been venerated by Christians for centuries as the burial cloth that wrapped the body of Jesus Christ in his tomb after his crucifixion and death. So, scientific tests that have been done over the years in order to find an answer to the question, who is the man of the shroud? The original cloth, which bears the images of a crucified man, is housed in a shielded chapel inside the place of its namesake, the Cathedral of Turin in Italy. In its place are many replicas on display for public viewing. One such replica is located in permanent exhibition at the Pontifical Institute Notre Dame of Jerusalem Center. The exhibit presents studies and possible reconstructions of crucifixion and the use of the shroud. The shroud, depicted here in photographic negative, bears the marks of a man who suffered injuries which parallel the account of Jesus' own suffering and crucifixion in the Bible. In the days of the Romans, a crown of thorns was made into the shape of a helmet. not a crown which only encircled the head. The shroud appears to show the crown of thorns was still upon the man's head when wrapped. The scourges used to whip Roman prisoners, like Jesus, were intended to inflict great suffering. The tips at the end of the leather thongs were knotted with pieces of either bone or metal. We can only conclude with certainty that the shroud image is that of a corpse of a man who was beaten and crucified. We also know that the body was taken out of the cloth without the cloth being unfolded. The answer to the question of how the image was produced or what produced the image remains, now as it has in the past, a mystery. The Church does not officially say whether or not the man of the shroud was Jesus, but for those of us who believe in Christ, St. John Paul II said this during his visit to Turin in May 1998. The shroud is a truly unique sign that points to Jesus, the true Word of the Father, and invites us to pattern our lives on the life of the one who gave himself for us. Later, another pope also publicly supported the belief that the shroud was soaked in the cloth that used to cover Jesus. In the centuries-old debate over the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin, Pope Benedict XVI weighed in favor of those who believe that the burial robe once cloaked Jesus Christ. Pope Benedict described the shroud, which allegedly bears bloodstains and the facial imprint of a long-haired bearded man, as an icon that once wrapped the remains of a crucified man in full correspondence with what the Gospels tell us of Jesus. The Vatican, which owns the linen cloth, has in the past tiptoed around the issue, describing it as a potent symbol of Jesus Christ's suffering, but never asserting outright its authenticity. Pope John Paul II visited the shroud when it last went on public display in 1998, but he said the Catholic Church had no specific competence to pronounce on its authenticity and urged further scientific analysis. Benedict prayed in front of the cloth at St. John the Baptist Cathedral in Turin, Italy, saying afterwards in a meditation that it was an icon written in blood, the blood of a man who was whipped, crowned with thorns, crucified, and injured on his right side. An historian puts it quite succinctly. It is either the most awesome and instructive relic of Christ in existence, or it is one of the most ingenious, most unbelievably clever products of the human mind and hand on record. It is either one or the other. There is no middle ground. If the shroud is real, it truly would be the most awesome relic in history. We need to have a little understanding of what relics are to appreciate this. Saving actual parts or pieces of clothing of the venerated dead is a practice that predates Christianity. It is said that the Greeks would keep pieces of Oedipus and venerate them in a semi-religious ceremony. Other cultures would also engage in similar practices. But for Christians, this practice became the norm when masses would be celebrated on altars built on top of tombs in the Roman catacombs, thus showing the greatest veneration for the bodies of those saints who went before us. It was only a short leap to begin collecting the clothing and other objects of the saints and venerating these objects. The Shroud of Turin, if it is real, would be a relic not of a saint, but of Jesus Christ himself. Think about it. If the shroud is real, it is a witness of the resurrection. Even the Blessed Virgin was not granted the grace to witness the resurrection. The shroud has not always been in Turin. Although today the shroud is associated with the Italian city of Turin, it has only been there for the last 400 years. Before that, it was in France. And before that, the history gets a little foggy. The discovery of a Hungarian document from 1192 confirms that the shroud was in Constantinople and captured in the Fourth Crusade. It is said that the Knights Templar would venerate it. When Constantinople was burned and looted, a letter of protest was sent to the Pope, which claimed that among the things stolen was the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death. The shroud has a history that includes both East and West. In the Eastern Church, there are documents that reference what is known as image not made by hands, which was discovered in the year 544. This image is believed to be the same shroud and became the basis for all Eastern and Orthodox icons and images of Jesus Christ. And why not? If it truly is the actual image of Jesus Christ, it should be the basis of every image we use of him. The radiocarbon dating that disproved the shroud has been disproved itself. With the advent of radiocarbon dating, the test was done on a piece of the shroud, and the results suggested that the shroud was from the 12th or 13th century, and certainly not from the 1st century. Many took this as evidence that the shroud is a fake, made by some artist over 1,000 years after Christ. However, further testing has been done and shown that the radiocarbon testing was actually done on pieces of cloth that were added to the original shroud to try to repair damage that the shroud suffered due to fire. Thus, the repairs are from the 12th or 13th century, but the original material of the shroud is still untested. Scientists of human anatomy claim that the image is correct. With knowledge of what happens to a human body after death by crucifixion that was not present in the 1st century and even in the 12th century, scientists today say that the image conforms to what they know would happen to a human body after death by crucifixion. If the shroud was created by an artist, that artist knew human anatomy to a level beyond every single other human being on the planet at the time. Knowledge that wouldn't be discovered for hundreds of years. The bloodstains are real. Scientists have also determined that the stains from the blood could not have been made by any kind of paint, that they display characteristics that only could have been made by human blood. So, the shroud wrapped some human bleeding from wounds in the same places Jesus Christ had them. The Shroud of Turin, which is believed to have wrapped Jesus' body after his crucifixion, is a seemingly inexhaustible source of discoveries and disputes for humanity worldwide, some seeing it as a simple icon symbolizing the death and resurrection of Christ, while others remain convinced of its authenticity because of the numerous studies supporting this idea. Dr. John Campbell recently discovered something truly amazing about the Shroud of Turin. One of the studies collected and shared with the public by Dr. John Campbell stands out with its conclusions regarding the true age of the burial cloth of Christ. Moreover, there is a wealth of documents from various other studies that aim to affirm the existence of this sacred cloth. So ultimately, which conclusion is accurate? What role does science play in the journey of faith? The Shroud of Turin does not belong to this age. A piece of linen about 14 feet long and 4 feet wide, the shroud bears bloodstains and the faint brownish image of a man's body, front and back, with wounds corresponding to those described in the Bible of the death of Jesus. Recently, the Roman Catholic Church announced that the Shroud of Turin could not be authentic because new scientific tests show that the linen dates from the Middle Ages. The shroud's custodian, Anastasio Cardinal Balestrero, revealed that radiocarbon tests conducted independently by 3 laboratories this year had concluded that the shroud cloth was created between 1260 and 1390. While church officials did not contest the test results, they said further research and evaluation would be necessary before the origins of the shroud were clearly established. These tests do not close the book on the shroud, said Cardinal Balestrero, who is the Archbishop of Turin. This is but another chapter in the shroud's story, or, as some would say, in the mystery of the shroud. The results of the carbon dating were eagerly awaited by believers and skeptics alike. The shroud's authenticity has been debated since it was first put on display in the mid-14th century, and in recent years it has been the object of intense scientific research, growing religious devotion and spreading curiosity. Despite the successful dating of the linen, Cardinal Balestrero emphasized, "After all this research, we do not have any plausible answers to explain how the image of Christ was created." The tests reported were on small patches of cloth that did not contain any of the dark spots that had been described as the image of Jesus. Many hypotheses advanced. So far, no conclusive, undisputed evidence has emerged to support any of the many hypotheses advanced by scholars to explain the image. One theory holds that the image was formed from particles of iron oxide, protein, and mercuric sulfide mixed by a forger to mimic human blood. Another theory advanced in recent years is that organic residue left on the cloth by some person was discolored by heat and aging to produce a brownish image. Whatever the case, tests far more extensive than any conducted so far would be needed to solve the puzzle of the image. In the Middle Ages, many objects appeared in Europe that were said to be the shroud of Jesus, fragments of his cross or other relics, but most were discarded as fakes long ago, and few others maintain a devoted following, as does the Shroud of Turin. Shroud has produced miracles. Cardinal Balestrero said, "The exceptional evocative power of the image of Jesus Christ should be preserved," adding, "I can assure you that the Holy Shroud has produced miracles and continues to." The shroud, which belongs to the Pope, has been kept for the last 410 years at the Cathedral of Turin, where it lies folded inside a silver casket. It is rarely put on public display. Millions of visitors came to see it when it was last exhibited in 1978, and at the same time a variety of scientists took the opportunity to subject the cloth to a series of analyses. In 1984, scholars presented the Vatican with a proposal for radiocarbon dating. After long negotiations with the church authorities, a plan for the dating analyses was announced early this year. The 3 laboratories selected by the church to conduct the tests were at Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Each laboratory was given a postage stamp-sized piece of the shroud, as well as control specimens of various ages, but only the British Museum, which coordinated the research, knew officially which specimen came from the shroud. Types of carbon compared. All the tests involved the same techniques. The sample's carbon atoms were brought to high energy in nuclear accelerators, and the percentage of carbon-14 was measured in comparison with other types of carbon. The procedure indicates an object's age because carbon-14 decays radioactively at a steady rate over time, changing its ratio to other types of carbon that do not decay. Cardinal Balestrero said that when Pope John Paul II was informed of the results, his response was, "Publish it." Luigi Gonella, scientific advisor to the Turin Archdiocese, said he was satisfied that the results from the 3 laboratories coincided to produce a 95% margin of accuracy, and that proper procedure had been followed to decontaminate the cloth from any particles of matter that could have distorted the dating. A full report on the analyses is being prepared for publication in a scientific journal, he said. Both Dr. Gonella and Cardinal Balestrero expressed their annoyance and disappointment that unknown members of the research effort had violated a voluntary secrecy agreement by disclosing the test results to the press. But both church officials said they were willing to consider future research projects on the shroud. The definitive investigation. French historian Jean-Christian Petitfils is one of the researchers who are passionate about finding the evidence of this precious linen cloth. The 4 decades he has devoted to the study of the shroud have convinced him that the face unveiled to the world by the Italian photographer Secondo Pia in 1898 is indeed that of Jesus Christ in the tomb. His extensive investigation, which compiled and analyzed all the studies ever made on the precious relic, including the famous carbon-14 study that cast doubt on the authenticity of the shroud, was recently published under the title Le Shroud de Turin, l'enquête définitive, namely The Shroud of Turin, the definitive investigation, rekindling intense debate on the subject, unveiling of the first recreation of the body of Christ based on the Shroud of Turin in Spain's Salamanca Cathedral. A historian specializing in the Ancien Régime, the political system of the Kingdom of France until the French Revolution, Petitfils is a Catholic who is also the author of highly acclaimed works on the life of Jesus. He has been interested in the Shroud of Turin for 44 years and it has fascinated him for the historical, archaeological, and scientific mystery it represents. It remains that the shroud gives us information about the passion of Christ. We know, for example, that he was flogged very violently, in the Roman way and not in the Jewish way, with a flagrum, which had two small balls and a barbell between them, the trace of which can be seen under a microscope. We can see that he was indeed crowned with thorns, that he was speared on the right side. The type of Roman spear used has even been identified, as there were several of them. He was really surprised by the results of the carbon-14 analysis in 1988 to 89, insofar as they were in contradiction with very reliable previous works, such as those of Professor Pierre Barbet of the Saint-Joseph Hospital, who established a relationship between the Passion of Jesus and all the available information about the shroud, or those of Professor Paul Vignon in the 1930s, showing an absolute and perfect correspondence between the iconography of Christ, which appeared as early as the end of the 4th century, and the face of the man on the shroud. A change of iconographic model occurred at this time, which corresponds to the arrival of this precious linen in the city of Edessa in present-day Turkey. It therefore seems impossible that a forgery could have been made in the Middle Ages, in the years 1260 to 1390, that is, the range provided by the radiocarbon laboratories. In addition, since 1978, the work of STURP, the American research group created by John Jackson, which had the shroud at its disposal for 2 days, and carried out, with several tons of material, very thorough analyses, including microchemical tests of spectrography, infrared radiometry studies, optical microscopy, ultraviolet fluorescence, etc., demonstrated that the author was not a medieval forger. In 2017, it emerged that the raw numbers, obtained thanks to young researcher Tristan Casabianca, showed an even greater dispersion in the results, so that statistically, there is only a 1% chance that the samples come from the same tissue. Of course, it is not the carbon-14 method that is at fault, but the linen, which is extremely polluted. Traces of fungus and calcium carbonate were found. Raymond Rogers, a very fine chemist who died in 2005, discovered that the sample area corresponded to a darned area. Modern threads were inserted in the 16th century in order to repair this area that had been worn away. Thus, the carbon-14 experiment is null and void today. Other work has been done since then, including by Professor Giulio Fanti of the University of Bologna, who from another method of dating based on the twisting of linen, arrived at a fairly wide time range, but which revolved around the pivotal axis of the year 33, the date of the burial of Jesus. Just recently, in April 2022, another Italian researcher, Professor Liberato De Caro of the Institute of Crystallography of the Italian Consiglio Nazionale delle Ricerche, using a particular X-ray method, came to the conclusion that this is indeed a linen from the 1st century. To this end, he compared a thread of this linen with another, taken from a cloth found at Masada, a citadel that the Romans stormed and destroyed in the year 73. After all, Jean-Christian Petitfils came to the conclusion quite early that the Shroud of Turin could not be a fake. It is the reason why he wanted to publish this book. It is no longer possible to say that it is a medieval cloth, nor that it could probably be the Jesus' shroud. No, its authenticity can no longer be disputed. Some last points. The combination of the above evidence is exceedingly difficult to explain in any way other than the burial cloth is that of Jesus of Nazareth. Moreover, the formation of the image by an intense outburst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation is suggestive of a resurrection event similar to that described in the Gospels. The above scientific evidence requires that a new carbon dating test be done, which observes the standard protocols for sampling. When these protocols are observed, it would be surprising if the result was not similar to the results of the 4 new dating methods mentioned above, approximately AD 50. If this result is obtained, it would indicate that the Shroud of Turin is very likely the burial shroud of Jesus Christ, with evidence suggestive of his resurrection in light. While we currently do not have a definitive explanation for how this unique and mysterious image was created from the body of a deceased man, the most plausible current hypothesis comes from a combination of two teams of researchers. Dr. John Jackson's team studied the shroud and proposed the vacuum ultraviolet radiation hypothesis in 2008. According to Jackson, an intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation produced a discoloration on the uppermost surface of the shroud's fibrils without scorching it, which gave rise to a perfect, three-dimensional negative image of both the frontal and dorsal parts of the body wrapped in it. Currently, we know of no natural explanation for the seemingly unique occurrence of such a burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation from either a decomposing body or the geological atmospheric conditions within a tomb. Though this is suggestive of a possible supernatural origin of the radiation, perhaps as a part of Jesus' resurrection, we cannot prove this scientifically, because we cannot construct a scientific test for a supernatural cause. All we can do is eliminate every known natural cause of this seemingly unique radiation. The uniqueness and current inexplicability of this phenomenon gives us reason to believe that God has given us evidence of Jesus' resurrection. This belief can be strengthened by further understanding of the light phenomenon that seems to be the source of the image, as well as the continued elimination of natural causes for it. The most convincing seems to be the hypothesis of Jackson. Scientists show the likelihood that sometime after the blood deposits had dried on the shroud, the decomposing body in the shroud emitted a short, intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation that led to a dehydration and discoloration of the frontal and dorsal parts of the shroud, giving rise to a perfect photographic negative image. Jackson's research also suggests that the body inside the shroud became mechanically transparent and emitted light evenly from every three-dimensional point within it. This allowed the frontal part of the shroud to collapse, creating an image of both the inside and outside of the hands, as well as a double image on the frontal part of the shroud. Currently, the known laws of physics cannot explain how a decomposing body can emit an intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation. Furthermore, they cannot explain how such a body could become mechanically transparent and emit light from every three-dimensional point within it. So, where does that leave us? If Jackson's explanation continues to be the only one to explain away the enigmas, and if future articulations of the laws of physics cannot explain how a decomposing body could become mechanically transparent and evenly emit vacuum ultraviolet radiation from every three-dimensional point within it, then we are left at the brink of a trans-physical or metaphysical explanation. Under these conditions, it would be both reasonable and responsible to believe that a trans-physical cause interacted with the decomposing body to transform it into an intense burst of light. Evidently, we cannot scientifically prove a trans-physical cause because science is restricted to the domain of physical causation. However, if the above conditions hold, we can reasonably infer the possibility and perhaps the likelihood of such a trans-physical cause. This is sufficient for reasonable and responsible belief. Does this trans-physical explanation of the shroud's image point to the resurrection of Jesus? Jesus' resurrection was not a resuscitation of a material corpse, but rather a transforming event that gave rise to what St. Paul called a spiritual body, a body transformed in glory, spirit, and power. Could this transformation of a material body into a burst of intense light signify the beginning point of the transformation of Jesus' body from a physical one to a spiritual, glorified one? Though there can be no scientific proof of this, it is a reasonable inference from the parallels between the explanation of the shroud's enigmatic image and the testimony of St. Paul and the Gospel writers. In this sense, we might say that the image on the shroud presents a clue, even a relic, of Jesus' resurrection. Why would we think the body in the shroud was that of Jesus? It is exceedingly improbable that the shroud is a medieval forgery. First, there are no paints, dyes, or other pigments on the shroud, except for the small flecks coming from the sanctification of icons and paintings which touched it. Second, the anatomical precision of the blood stains, which are real human blood that congealed on the shroud before the formation of the image, are in precise anatomical correlation to the image itself. How could a medieval forger have accomplished this? Third, it is exceedingly difficult to explain how pollen grains indigenous to Palestine appeared in abundance on a shroud of probable Semitic origin, if it originated in medieval Europe, and how coins minted in AD 29 in Palestine appeared on the eyes of the man on the shroud. How could a medieval forger have duplicated these first-century Palestinian characteristics of the shroud? Fourth, the 5 enigmas of the image on the shroud almost certainly preclude a forgery. How could a medieval forger have used vacuum ultraviolet radiation to discolor the cloth on the uppermost surface of the fibrils? How could he have created a perfect photographic negative image? How could he have created a double image on the frontal part of the shroud? And how could he have known how to duplicate the interior and exterior of the hands in perfect proportion to each other? Thus, it does not seem reasonable or responsible to believe that the shroud is a medieval forgery. Beyond this, there are 3 probative kinds of evidence pointing specifically to Jesus' place and time of origin and to his unique crucifixion and resurrection. The material of the shroud, the pollen grains on it, and the coins on the man's eyes all have their origin in first-century Palestine, the place where Jesus was purported to have died. The bloodstains come from a crucifixion event identical to the one described in the 4 Gospels, which was very unusual, if not unique in many respects, such as being crowned with thorns, being flogged, and being pierced with a Roman pilum. The 5 enigmas of the shroud's image point to a trans-physically caused burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation from a mechanically transparent body. This is suggestive of the transformation of Jesus' body from a physical one to a spiritual glorified one, as reported by St. Paul in the 4 Gospels. The spiritual glorified transformation of Jesus' body was unique to the Christian view of resurrection. It was not known in Judaism, which held to a resuscitation of the flesh, or pagan cults, which held to ethereal or ghost-like views of immortality. Thus, the enigmas on the shroud's image point to the uniquely Christian view of resurrection implied by Jesus' risen appearance. The odds of this first-century Palestinian burial shroud, with the unique features of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, being that of anyone else is exceedingly remote, inasmuch as the image is not a forgery and that it originated from a real person living at the time of Jesus, crucified in the unique way of Jesus and producing a burst of intense vacuum ultraviolet radiation from his decomposing body. Who else would it be? Given all this, we might reasonably infer that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus, which contains not only a relic of his crucifixion, but also his resurrection in glory. If so, it shows both the truth of the most significant event in human history as well as the accuracy of the gospel accounts of it. The greatest message of the Shroud of Turin. The Holy Shroud of Turin is primarily given to a relic now preserved at Turin, for which the claim is made that it is the actual clean linen cloth in which Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. This relic, though blackened by age, bears the faint but distinct impress of a human form, both back and front. If the marks we perceive were caused by human body, it is clear that the body, supine, was laid lengthwise along one half of the shroud, while the other half was doubled back over the head to cover the whole front of the body, from the face to the feet. The shroud was brought into Turin, Italy, in 1578, and has been kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin since 1694. The shroud goes on exhibition only a few times a century, and when it does, millions of people slowly file past it to see the front and back images of the crucified man. The shroud is woven from linen thread made from the stems of the flax plant. In making linen thread, flax fibers are separated from the rest of the stem by allowing the stems to rot in water. The diameter of these fibers is about 15 to 20 which is about a fifth of the diameter of a human hair. A typical linen thread contains about 100 of these fibers. Luke and the other 3 Gospels include this account of Jesus' burial after his crucifixion. On the morning of Jesus' resurrection, Luke records that Peter saw the strips of linen by themselves, whereas the Gospel of John states that Peter saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. This separate cloth has generated passionate interest today because many people think it might be the Shroud of Turin, believed to be Jesus' burial cloth. If true, the shroud would provide compelling evidence for the truth of Christianity. But is it really Jesus' burial cloth? What we know and what we don't know. The answer to that question relies on historical, scientific, and biblical data, as well as input from many other disciplines. Often, the actual data and the popular conception don't line up well and make it difficult to understand the complex issues surrounding the shroud. It seems indisputable that the shroud came from someone who was crucified. Further, the image and stains on the shroud validate the Bible's description of crucifixion. As physical evidence of that restoration, the shroud presents a mirror of the gospel, which is sacrificial love beyond all fathoming. Everything depends on it and is downstream from it. Everything else is scaffolded on this revelation. Jesus told us, "Take up your cross each day and follow me," meaning that his cross and passion are inextricably woven into the life of his followers. The Paschal mystery, Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, is the source and summit of Christian life. If you look at the Gospels themselves, they are passion narratives with long introductions. Pope Benedict XVI stated, "Don't be afraid of the cross. It's the source of every blessing." The wounded Christ, clearly depicted on the shroud, invites the faithful to claim his wounds, as well as their own, as a conduit of grace. They are precisely where his grace flows into us. Jesus, upon his death on the cross, descended into the world, filling it with light and hope. When light shines in darkness, the darkness is dispelled. So it is when Christ freely lays down his life and takes it back up. He's showing himself as being utterly of a higher order, Dr. Dalton pointed out. In truth, God has already definitively won the battle. The only question is, are we remaining in Christ? Christ, the head, is already seated in glory. If we're members of his body, if we remain with him, we are co-heirs. Regarding Jesus' death and resurrection, we have the documents. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and others. And we have monuments, namely, archaeological objects such as the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo, the latter being the cloth that covered Jesus' face while he was taken down from the cross. These objects are consistent with scriptural accounts of Jesus' passion and death. Not only are they compatible with the biblical narrative, but they're mutually illuminating. The artifact on one hand and the narrative on the other hand, both shedding light on each other. Every attempt to reproduce the shroud by any naturalistic means has failed. People can't do it in a lab, especially not at the micro level. Every detail, from the shape of the body and the ratios of one limb to the other, to the blood flows, to the folding of the thumbs from damage to the nerves in the hands, is captured with medical precision. In-depth studies of the shroud in the 1970s ruled out the presence of varnish, pigments, brush strokes, directionality, or any trace whatsoever of human artwork. Nor was the image produced by heat or by any type of photography, which wasn't invented until the 19th century. There are multiple hypotheses for how the shroud came into being, but none can be scientifically proven. That's where Christians need to step up and say, What if it was not created by naturalistic means? What if it's the natural result of a supernatural occurrence? The message of the Shroud of Turin is the same as that of the gospel narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. God's unfathomable love. Jesus shows divine love in ways that we simply cannot doubt. It is in deed and in truth that He loves us. And when you look at the cross, when you're looking at His image in the shroud, you're seeing Him say, "I love you." You must know this. Every detail in the biblical narratives of the Passion reveals some aspect of that love. It would be too easy to glance over the details of the Passion, but the shroud forces you to pause on it. The cross was the means by which Jesus, who had emptied Himself of glory in becoming human, returned to His glorified state at the right hand of the Father. In order to follow Christ, people must take up their own crosses in the form of the trials they face each day. Jesus tells us, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So, can we expect any other pathway than the one He showed us? Learning about and venerating the shroud inevitably leads to a deeper understanding of the mission Jesus came to fulfill. Beholding and contemplating the image of Christ causes transformation to come within us. In that way, the shroud is just the doorbell. It says, "Come in." The shroud offers an astounding opportunity and a credible means of sharing the gospel with people who do not yet believe. Our faith is not about fairy tales or fables, but an event in history that actually took place. We celebrate the incarnation, that the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. From that place, He's reborn into glory. That's a picture of what we all must also do. We die with Him in order to rise with Him. Because of its holy meaning, you may wonder how to visit the Turin Shroud. If you're traveling to Turin or the surrounding areas, you must visit the Turin Cathedral, where the Holy Shroud is kept. But bear in mind, the original cloth is not on public display. The shroud is in such a fragile state that it isn't put on display for the general public. It is guarded by bulletproof glass and security cameras. You can visit the chapel where it's safely kept, and you will see a replica of the shroud. The good news is that you might be able to see the real shroud in all its glory if you travel to Turin in 2025. The Pope announced that the Shroud of Turin might be displayed to the public in 2025, coinciding with the Jubilee year. Specific dates are not confirmed yet, but the Vatican will announce them soon. Hopefully. The rare display of the Turin Shroud already happened in 2000, 2010, and 2015. If it happens in 2025, or maybe 2026, it will be a big event for the Christian community and Turin. So if you plan to visit the city, you better plan it as soon as the Vatican announces the dates. If you can't make it to the 2025 Holy Shroud public display, and if only admiring the Shroud Chapel is not enough for you, there is a place where you can get more info and be a bit closer to it. The Most Holy Shroud Museum, in Italian, Il Museo della Sindone, is where you need to go. At the museum, you can learn details about the shroud's fascinating history and its many mysteries, replicas, and incredible displays of the artifact.